Most people assume that survival in the medieval North depended on fire. Fire for heat, fire for cooking, fire for light. In popular imagination, the Viking household is a roaring longhouse with smoke curling into the rafters while snow buries the roof outside. But archaeology tells a more complicated story. In many cases, heat was conserved, managed, and even generated in ways that did not rely on constant flames. And the most important survival technology was not a weapon, not a ship, and not a furnace. It was the floor. The Norse did not survive Scandinavian winters simply by burning more wood. Wood was valuable. Labor was limited. Smoke inside enclosed structures was dangerous. Instead, they engineered their living spaces to trap, store, and slowly release heat. What they understood without modern thermodynamics was that the ground itself could be transformed from a liability into an asset. Modern housing, despite central heating and insulation, often ignores the same principle. To understand this, we have to start not with raids, but with soil. When we look closely at how Viking houses were built, we begin to see a pattern beneath our feet. Across Norway, Iceland, Denmark, and the North Atlantic settlements, longhouses were rarely simple timber structures sitting above ground. Many were partially sunken. Builders excavated shallow trenches or depressions, then constructed thick turf or sod walls around them. These walls were not decorative. They were thermal batteries. So, Earth has mass, and mass stores heat. When a house is dug even just a little bit into the ground, it benefits from the relatively stable temperature you'll find below the frost line. In winter, the soil beneath the structure actually stays a lot warmer than the freezing air above. By lowering the floor and thickening the surrounding earth walls, Viking builders could reduce heat loss and really minimize exposure to wind. In Iceland, where timber was scarce and winter could be just brutal, turf houses reached a kind of architectural sophistication that, honestly, modern energy-efficient design has only recently rediscovered. Layered sod blocks formed walls that were often more than a meter thick. Underneath those walls, packed earth floors weren't just left bare. They were compacted, sometimes layered with organic material, and regularly maintained. The goal here wasn't about aesthetic comfort, but about controlled insulation. The Norse really understood something fundamental. Air is easier to heat than soil, but soil holds on to heat for much longer. Instead of constantly producing heat, what they did was conserve it. And the misconception that Viking homes were dominated by roaring fires kind of obscures just how carefully fire was actually used. Yes, longhouses had central hearths, but these fires were not always blazing. Wood in Scandinavia, especially in marginal settlements, required a lot of labor to cut, transport, and dry. In Iceland and Greenland, fuel could include driftwood, peat, or even dried animal dung. None of these were resources to waste. A constantly burning large fire inside a semi-enclosed space also creates ventilation challenges. Smoke inhalation was a real threat. Many longhouses lacked chimneys. Smoke escaped through roof vents or porous thatch. Too much fire meant more than discomfort. It meant respiratory illness and structural damage. So instead of maximizing flame, Viking households optimized retention. Heated stones placed near or beneath floor surfaces acted as slow-release sources of warmth. Embers were banked carefully to preserve heat overnight, without full combustion. Thick bedding platforms were raised above the coldest part of the floor, often along the walls where insulation was strongest. The floor, in other words, was part of the heating system. When we shift focus from weapons to architecture, we see survival as an engineering problem. The sagas describe winter as a season of endurance and calculation. Travel was limited. Livestock required shelter. Food stores had to last. But the built environment played a quiet role in every one of these concerns. Sunken floors reduced air volume inside the house, making it easier to maintain stable temperatures. Thick turf absorbed daytime warmth and released it slowly at night. In some excavated sites, archaeologists have found evidence of layered floor construction. Organic bedding materials, ash deposits, and compacted earth, indicating deliberate management of moisture and insulation. Moisture control was as important as heat. Cold alone does not kill as efficiently as cold combined with dampness. By elevating sleeping areas and managing airflow at ground level, Norse builders reduced condensation and frost buildup. The floor was not a passive surface, it was a thermal buffer. This approach influenced settlement patterns across the North Atlantic. When Norse settlers reached Greenland in the late 10th century, they encountered a harsher climate than mainland Scandinavia. Timber was scarce. Winter lasted longer, yet they replicated the same semi-subterranean, turf-heavy construction techniques. These choices were not cultural nostalgia. They were practical adaptation. The eastern and western settlements of Greenland depended on livestock and stored fodder. That required indoor shelter that did not freeze solid. Thick turf walls and insulated floors created microclimates stable enough for survival. Even so, climate shifts during the Little Ice Age eventually overwhelmed these systems. Archaeological evidence suggests that as temperatures dropped further, existing architectural adaptations were no longer sufficient. The Greenland Norse did not disappear because they forgot how to survive winter. They disappeared because environmental change outpaced their structural resilience. This is where the lesson deepens. Engineering buys time. It does not eliminate risk. The Viking floor was also a social and strategic space. Longhouses were not simply dwellings. They were political centers, storage facilities, and defensive refuges. In winter, when travel halted and raids ceased, communities consolidated indoors. Heat management affected morale, health, and hierarchy. Raised platforms along the walls, where family members slept, were positioned to take advantage of insulation and residual warmth. The central aisle, often lower and colder, functioned as workspace and livestock holding area in some cases. The difference in elevation reflected both thermal logic and social organization. This design also influenced military readiness. A community that conserved fuel and maintained stable indoor temperatures preserved strength through winter. Malnourished, cold populations do not launch effective spring campaigns. Norse raiding seasons began after winter endurance tests. Architecture was therefore indirectly connected to military capability. Modern survival discourse often focuses on stockpiling and weaponry. Viking survival suggests a quieter truth. Infrastructure determines endurance. Why do modern homes so often ignore what Viking builders understood intuitively? Contemporary housing in cold climates frequently prioritizes above-ground construction, with mechanical heating systems compensating for heat loss. Concrete slabs are poured directly over minimally insulated foundations. Heat escapes downward. Energy bills rise. Mechanical systems compensate. The Viking approach inverted that logic. Instead of fighting the ground, they partnered with it. Earth-sheltered construction is now recognized in passive house design and sustainable architecture. Thermal mass, subgrade insulation, and reduced air volume are principles echoed in modern green building, but they're often treated as innovations rather than rediscoveries. Hidden in history. The ancient floor hack was simple. Use the ground's stable temperature as an ally. Compact it, insulate it, integrate it into the heating strategy. For survivalists and preparedness-minded viewers, this has implications beyond historical curiosity. In prolonged grid failure scenarios, fuel scarcity becomes immediate. Mechanical heating systems fail. Structures that depend entirely on active heating rapidly become uninhabitable in severe winter conditions. A semi-subterranean, well-insulated floor retains warmth long after the flame dies down. A raised sleeping platform over insulated ground conserves body heat more effectively than a bed in a drafty room. These are not romantic notions. They are tested historical realities, hidden in history. There were limits to this system, and those limits shaped history. The Norse were adaptive, but adaptation required labor and community cohesion. Turf walls must be maintained. Floors must be kept dry. Embers must be managed. These are continuous tasks. When external pressures increased, whether from climate deterioration, trade disruption, or political fragmentation, the maintenance burden became heavier. Archaeological layers in some settlements showed declining structural upkeep over time. Thinner walls, less careful construction, greater vulnerability. This pattern appears repeatedly in history. Infrastructure decays before political collapse becomes visible. Winter exposes weakness faster than war. Hidden in history. By studying Viking winter architecture, we see how environmental management intersects with social stability. Survival is not a single event, it is a sustained system. What this reveals about overlooked aspects of military and survival history is important. Military history often privileges decisive battles and charismatic leaders, but endurance across seasons determines which societies remain capable of fighting at all. The Norse did not expand across the North Atlantic solely because of maritime skill. They survived winters that would have crippled less prepared populations. Their understanding of thermal mass, ground insulation, and structural efficiency allowed them to conserve resources for mobility and expansion. In that sense, the floor beneath the longhouse contributed as much to Norse geopolitical reach as the longship. When later European powers colonized cold regions, similar principles reappeared. Russian peasant izbas, North American sod houses, and even World War II field fortifications often incorporated semi-subterranean design for insulation and concealment. The logic persisted because physics does not change with fashion. Yet in many modern urban environments, we build as if constant energy abundance is guaranteed. We construct boxes that require perpetual input. The Viking model assumes scarcity as a baseline condition, and that may be the most important lesson. Understanding the floor beneath us changes how we think about resilience. The Viking winter was not defeated with spectacle. It was endured through design, through thick walls, through compacted earth, through the careful banking of embers rather than the reckless burning of fuel. Their survival was not accidental. It was architectural. When we overlook these quieter elements of history, we misunderstand how societies actually endure. We celebrate the raid, but ignore the winter that made the raid possible. We analyze the battle but neglect the floor that kept warriors alive long enough to fight it. Remembering these details matters because they shift our focus from drama to infrastructure, from momentary victory to sustained resilience. The ancient floor hack is not a romantic relic. It is a reminder that survival begins beneath our feet. If you value this kind of deeper historical analysis, where overlooked structures and decisions reveal the foundations of power, subscribe to Hidden in History. And if this examination of Viking winter survival added something meaningful to your understanding, share the video with someone who appreciates the quieter forces that shape history.